if leadership is ultimately about influence,
Mm,
and how effectively you influence someone else starts with how effectively you influence yourself. Put another way,
exactly.
if you ask something of me that you yourself are not modeling, I am not going to believe you. And if I don't believe you, that has a cascading effect. My belief to my attitude to my emotion to my behavior, to my actions, to my results. And it all starts at the top of the thread. What do you believe?
Welcome to Change Leadership Conversations, where we dive into what it takes to lead change in today's disruptive and fast paced world. I'm Yvonne Ruke, Akpoveta, the founder of the Change Leadership. We create change leadership workshops, content, courses, and community. Today's guest is Carl Oxholm, someone whose approach to leadership is anything but conventional and deeply needed right now. Hi, Carl. Welcome to Change Leadership Conversations. I'm excited to have you today. And Carl, I just want to give you flowers, right? Because so many times we never end up saying those things we
Mm.
want to say to people. And so I believe at every opportunity we get, let's just do it. The way we met was just so crazy. It was out of the blue. Somebody introduced me to you. We had coffee, and it was a stranger who introduced me to you. So, I mean, they were a stranger to me. I just happened to be, I have met them. So I said, "Oh, you should meet Carl. He's into all emotionally intelligent. I met you. We connected." But I say this all the time to you, Carl, and I believe I've said it to you before. I meet so many people, so many leaders, so many people in positions of authority. And there's a difference in when you leave their presence, how you feel when you've left their presence. You leave the presence of some people, and if you don't have any self belief in yourself, they can make you feel small. But when I met with you the first time, and every time I continue to meet with you, you lift, you constantly just lift, the person that you're with. And you just lifted me. Your presence just lifted me. It was like you speak into people's lives. So for that, I want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. That is beautiful and wonderful and so appreciated. Thanks, Yvonne.
It's an honor. It's an honor to have you here. So, Cal, there's so much to you when we hear what it is you've done and we learn of some of all of the things you've done. But, to start us off, I would love for you to tell us about your career journey and what you're focused on right now.
Yeah, and happy to. And can I just say, thanks to your beautiful introduction and very kind words, right out of the gate, you know me. So if something pops into my head, I'm happy to share it. My mom, even when I was just a little guy, she would call me Carly, and she'd say, Carly, if you practice living in the present, you will always live with presence. And I say that only because, speaking of energy, she was way ahead of her time. And at the
Mm,
time when she expressed that to me, maybe I wasn't really familiar with what she meant by it. But then over time, I started to realize, imagine if every time you entered into an exchange with someone, you were mindful of not only the quality of the experience you're co-creating with them, but the desire to at least sustain the energy where it started, but optimally, maybe even lift it. I mean, imagine
mm,
if that was a challenge that you decided to give yourself
mm.
every time you interacted with another wonderful individual, knowing fully well that learning is always two-way. So,
Yes.
so the other thing I want to share with you is you said those wonderful things about me. I can literally reflect back that that's because of who you are.
Mm,
And so you bring the best out of individuals, you help elevate that energy, and you make the conversation and the learning fun.
mm.
So when you're entering into an exchange like that, how can the energy be anything but uplifting? And so I just want to say it takes two. The learning is always really by capacity. It goes in both directions, but also just a nice challenge to your listeners that are you mindful of the opportunity to co-create an experience
Yes.
that can be meaningful? And
Mm,
I will tell you that the answer for most individuals is, you know what? I wasn't really aware of that. I was
mm,
just entering into the meeting. I thought, okay, this is someone who's been introduced to me. Let's see where it goes. But they're not really mindful of the opportunity that they have to co-create something that could be meaningful. If nothing else, even marginally uplifting might be nice. But the one thing you really never want to do is leave that exchange with the other person feeling diminished. And
Exactly.
yeah, so just even bringing a little more awareness to that might be helpful for your listeners to experiment with. And by the way, if you hear me throughout this conversation reference the word practice,
Mm.
it's because the bridge from theory to mastery is practice. You can only talk about these things for
Yes,
so
and you're
long.
going to leave us with a few practices today. We
Yeah.
love what you said about leaving that with our change leaders, our audiences, change leaders, professionals, folks who are really just interested in how we lead, navigate change, especially in today's disruptive business environment. And oftentimes, as change leaders, we're constantly engaging with our teams, our stakeholder, our audiences, and just that nugget, being mindful of how we approach that situation has the ability to change the energy in that situation and what we take out of that situation. Because we're probably, when we're introducing change, we're probably faced with people who are already a little bit apprehensive about our present, a little
And by the way,
defensive already.
you're alluding to the other point, which is, so in the midst of this ongoing change and the magnitude of it and the frequency, et cetera, great. So now you're here. To what end do you want to influence this exchange? Where is it that we're going? Why is it that we're here? How is it that we want this experience to unfold? And all of these questions are really neat opportunities to exchange in a way that it's really meaningful for the individual on the other side of the equation. And so, again, if leadership is ultimately about influence,
Mm,
and how effectively you influence someone else starts with how effectively you influence yourself. Put another way,
exactly.
if you ask something of me that you yourself are not modeling, I am not going to believe you. And if I don't believe you, that has a cascading effect. My belief to my attitude to my emotion to my behavior, to my actions, to my results. And it all starts at the top of the thread. What do you believe? What do
Exactly.
you believe about yourself? The opportunity to influence in a way that just might be a little more helpful, thanks to you having been a part of it, as opposed to had you not been there at all. And if that's your litmus test, that's exciting. And I find that can be the other thing that can do is it can allow individuals to stay in the driver's seat. In other words, rather than being a victim of my circumstance, you realize you're not your circumstance. You have an opportunity to shape the change before
Yes.
you.
Hmm.
So how do you want to shape it? Do you want to
Yes.
shape it as a leader? And is that going to be different than if you were a spectator, a victim, or a cynic? And we can explore all that a little later. But anyway,
Yes, we're
I
gonna.
digress. I digress.
That's what I love about being in your presence. We just start to explore awesome things and learn new things and all of those nuggets that you already drop in. I just love it. So taking us back to a bit of a career, nearly 30 years, PwC Canada, partner, introduced the whole emotional intelligence program. Now you are leading your own organization, which you founded, written an awesome book, which we're going to dig into a little bit. So for you, if there was one thing that described your career trajectory in terms of how did you make those decisions to get you to where you are today, sought after a global speaker?
Yeah, you know what? Thanks, Yvonne. I learned many, many years ago, thanks to my mom and dad and other loved ones. Of course, my family now, Julie, Scott, Haley are remarkable. I learned early on to practice what my mom and dad always referred to as being a student of my own experience. In other words, rather than trying to always have the answers, practice living into the answers, being open, being constructive, which means accept what is and then construct, build upward, whatever the possibility might be for both myself and those in my care. And so along the way, I started to lean in. My mom and dad also taught me, be curious about life, what life is teaching you about what your strengths are. So life has a wonderful way of mirroring back to you where your greatest strengths are. So when somebody pulls you aside and says, Yvonne, I just have to tell you, the way you facilitated that conversation, or the way you lifted everybody, or the way you helped someone become a believer in themselves, or you encourage them, etc. Life is always giving you clues and cues about what your greatest strengths are. And you would do well to be mindful of that, be grateful
Mm,
for that, and then lean into that in service of a need that matters, both to
I
you,
love that. Life
that's
is
a
always giving you clues and cues and leaning into that.
yeah, and leaning into that. So we hear oftentimes play to your strengths, but what we don't talk a lot about is, so tell me what you know your strengths to be. And then moreover, how do you know that? And of course, life will be teaching you these things all along. And so when you asked me earlier, how did you make some of the decisions along the way? I honored what life was teaching me about my own strengths. I wasn't dismissive of them. This isn't about ego. This was about observation. This was about realizing that in certain circumstances, I had certain abilities that seemed to really make a meaningful difference in service of the moment. And so, how is it that I was able to do that? Was it different from some of my other colleagues who were brilliant and beautiful and I loved teaming with, but who within themselves had their own strengths? And
Yeah.
so they would reach out to me and say, Carl, thank goodness you're leading this, because that's the last thing I would ever want to do. So that was also interesting to me. It was like, not only was I able to really help in certain areas, but there was a need there, and it was a need that not everybody else wanted to service. So the
Mhm.
other nugget that I took away from that along the way was, don't assume that your strengths are shared by everybody,
Yes.
and don't assume that every issue is going to be served equally by the same set of strengths. This is why when we say diverse teams are always stronger than ones that are not diverse, that's what we mean. We're talking about that diversity of thought, yes, but also
Yes.
that amalgam of different strengths, nuances, insights that simply make us better because we have fewer blind spots, a greater ability to empathize, and it's just way more fun. Because when you're with other people who are not only talented and jazzed about something, but they're practiced in that space and they want to do it. The greatest thing you can do is align people with their greatest strengths, doing what we need, but because they want to do it.
I
And
just love
so,
what it is that you're
yeah,
especially, people sit down and think it's some magic wheel that, I'm going to spin it and I'm going to find out what my strengths are and they're going to automatically know what it is. Or some people sit down and they want to know their career trajectory for the next 5, 10 years. And that leaves them drained sometimes because they're forgetting to be in the present and lean into what they're hearing about their strengths. Those, like you say, clues and cues to when people say, oh, I'll leave this to you. You're so good at this. That's a clue, into, okay, maybe I'm really good at this. Because there's sometimes in our strengths, we assume that everybody, must be able to do this. Or, how we use the terminology common sense, right? Oh, this is common sense. And common sense is really not that common.
yes, sense not commonly practiced.
Yes.
And again, if you allow, so just imagine, right? If you're an hour ultimate and your listener's ultimate litmus test was, can I contribute in such a way that this moment is just a little better than it otherwise would have been had I not been here?
Yeah.
Now unpack that for a second. What does it actually mean to do that? It actually means, whether you're even conscious of it or not, that you're going to lean on not only the experience of you, so all of the wisdom that you bring into this moment, but aligned with your greatest strengths, because that's where you're going to tend. That's essentially what's going to tend to come to the surface. There's a reason why certain people lean into certain things, even if they don't know it. Take you, for example. So we know that speaking in public is second only to death in terms of on the fear scale, right? And yet here you are facilitating, national global leadership forums where you're doing it all the time. And for many people, that would be just a death knell. But for you, it's like, I come alive. I
Mhm.
feed off the energy in the room, but you're also mindful of influencing the energy in the room so that bi-directional capacity and responsibility and opportunity to emotionally have other people infected with positive possibility, etc., that means something to you. So when you and I are in the same meeting together, your ability to lean in and bring up issues that someone else in the room won't even think of, let alone want to service, can, that's going to be something that you're going to find fun. So when people say, do these things and you'll never work another day in their life, okay, well, a lot of people get exhausted hearing those kinds of catchphrases because they're like, no, no, this is work. And it's like, yes, true. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. I'll put it another way. I once had somebody say to me, the biggest problem with people these days, Carl, is that they're always choosing the path of least resistance.
Mhm.
Surely you'll agree with that. And I smiled and I said, I'm quite sure I know what you mean by that. But what if the meaning of that expression was a little different than what you're intending? Because what you're intending when you say that is they want to do the bare minimum. And it's always what's in it for me. But what if the path of least resistance actually meant someone who was self-aware enough and conscious enough to know their strengths, to find the greatest challenges of the day that encompassed a need, and then leaned into it accordingly? What if the path of least resistance was actually just me knowing my strengths and deciding I'm actually going to put them into use for the benefit of those in my care? What if that was the path of
Exactly.
least resistance?
Yes. And an example I want to share with you, which is happened to me the other day. I had to send these emails out. It was very simple to send these emails out, just sending some emails to a couple of people. But it was so opposite of me, right? In terms of it wasn't the type of work that brought me joy, but it was easy to do. I would literally write it, grab a coffee. It just felt so hard. But when I'm in a place of joy, something that I feel is purposeful, something that I enjoy doing, that I absolutely love to do, I can be in a flow state for 3 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, and not even think about food or eating and lose track of time.
Right.
And I'm just in that whole state, and it feels the path of least resistance. But when I'm in a state of outside of my strength area, something I struggle with, something that is opposite to what and who I am, it just takes me so long to do it. It's something that literally would take somebody 5 minutes to do, using an hour to do. So totally love the description you've given about what path of least resistance means. And I want to jump back a little bit to something that it is that you said, which I love about diversity. When we
Mm.
understand our strengths and the strengths of our teams, that makes a whole lot of difference with how we lead and drive change, because we bring in the strengths from different areas. We don't have to be the person that does everything. And we're now starting to, one of the things we were talking about earlier, we're now starting to 10x our efforts, right? When we're bringing in a team that is diversity of thoughts, diversity of strength, diversity of representation, diversity of perspectives, all of those help us to lead change more effectively because we're leveraging the strength of so many people.
Particularly when you have agreement around the why, the mission,
Mm,
the purpose, the vision, which is the where we're heading, where we're marching together, in what direction, etc., and the how, which are the values. When you have shared values and behavioral expectations of your brand, be it an organization or an individual, whatever the case may be, and you've got a clear consensus around why you're here, why this matters, your reason for being, etc., then all of those diversities actually come together and gel in a way that superpowers your ability to get to where you want to go. That's when clearly two heads are better than one, three are better than two, four are better than three, etc. But if you don't have alignment around the why, the purpose, the where it is we want to go, and the how we're expected to behave, that's when you can run into some gaps and some issues, right?
let's call it what is. You can run into chaos.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
So I want to jump into your book, right? Your book, Biology of Leadership, was ranked number 2 on Forbes list of top leadership books. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
When we look at the book, when you think about the book, what is the single biggest takeaway from the book for leaders who are navigating change today, or for those who are leading change?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's almost impossible to have one answer because so many different wonderful readers have concluded differently about the answer to that. They've all picked so many different areas, not the
Okay,
least
so
of.
give us 3. Let me make it easy.
Oh no, I will. For me, I will tell you, I will answer it. I will tell you, for me, even though there's an awful lot there to unpack, I will say in an everyday conversation, it distills down to, will you give yourself permission to be who you are in service of the moment for both your benefit and the benefit of those that you care for? Now, that sounds very simplistic, but the truth is I encounter so many individuals who simply either don't know how or didn't realize it was an option to give themselves permission to truly show up authentically as themselves. Now, what do we mean by authentically? We're in a world where most books, well, I shouldn't say that, many books from amazing, don't misunderstand me, amazing experts in the field, etc. But notice patterns around 10 life laws, 7 steps, 3 essentials. There's these answers that say, if only you would do these things, then.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've noticed, it's almost a sadness amongst a lot of people who then they buy it, they read it, they do those things, and yet those same results don't befall them or. And the truth is, there's a lot of individuals who end up pretending to be someone or something they're not.
Yes.
And my point is that, I'll use you as a proxy, Yvonne, like you're a unique amalgam of experience, never to be again. Like you're the life experience that is you and that manifests from you, through you, emanates for the benefit of others, will never be again. And so if you're not true to who you are in terms of knowing your strengths, leaning in the opportunity to serve, understanding the need, etc., but doing it authentically as yourself, vis-a-vis, i.e., you pretend to be someone or something you're not, well, someone else is already doing that. So the second we pretend to be someone or something we're not, everybody loses. When I say you're a unique amalgam of experience, what I mean by that is the second you deviate from that and pretend to be someone or something you're not, life itself no longer can learn about itself.
Mm-hmm.
But if instead you're like, you know what? I have had a unique path. We all have. What have I learned along the way? How do I want to leverage that learning for the benefit of others? Moving in what direction? That's what I mean. If you'll give yourself permission to do it. So then you might ask, how do we know if we're making progress to that end? Well, first of all, how are you caring for yourself? How'd you sleep last night? How are you eating? How are you socializing? Are you mindful of the company you keep? Are you surrounded by individuals who are celebrating your strengths and celebrating you? Or are you surrounding yourself with toxicity? On and on and on. There's any number of things you can do, but if the quality of your energy is compromised, then the focus of your energy won't be aligned with you being able to give the best of who you are in service of the moment. And then when the focus of the energy, where that implies it's okay, so authentic, original, one of a kind, Yvonne, what do you want to be intentional about? Where are you placing your attention? To what end? So that's where then the focus of your energy comes from. And then how are you going to express yourself? So how many times at the end of a senior executive meeting, when the leader, the most senior leader in the room says, so everybody, any comments, any questions? How many times do you guess there's actually a comment or a question? Do you guess that it's often? You would be wrong. Exactly. Most of the time, it's met with silence. That's actually a litmus test. And the reason it's a litmus test for authenticity is because, let me put it differently, every single person in that room has a thought.
Yes.
They have a point of view. The question isn't, do you have one? The question is, do you feel safe enough to share it?
Yes.
Do you feel validated enough in your voice that it might just matter to the room, to the moment, to where you're going? And I will go so far as to say, when you are around a team where that authenticity, that originality has been celebrated, where people are selected thanks to their strengths, those individuals not only know they have a voice, they feel a sense of responsibility to share that voice on the off chance that it might just be exactly what we needed in this moment. And we're not going to leave not saying it to chance, because it could actually move the needle in terms of change in a way that is more beneficial for all involved. So longer answer, but just to say, because of fear, because of, well, who am I? Another quick story. Co-op student shows up, they're in a meeting, they're allowed to just shadow, and they walk out of that meeting, and they said all these brilliant things after the meeting and all these questions. And I asked them, did you happen to share one, two, or three of those questions at the end when everyone was asked, do they have any comments or observations? Or, oh goodness, no, who am I? I mean, like, I would never dream of that. And I said, well, so just so you're clear for next time, I will remind you who you are. You're actually the freshest lens on whether this organization is as great as it thinks it is. And what did I mean by that? Well, the organization had, of course, professed and espoused, here's our mission, this is our vision, these are our values, etc. And here's this brand new individual coming in, fresh lens. And what was the experience in that room? Were people celebrating one another? Were they actually positively reinforcing one another for the behavior they wanted to see more of? Were they role modeling the very values this person had just been recruited in and asked to model in kind, et cetera? And she was like, wow, I never even realized that I had that kind of an opportunity, right? So that's what I would say.
That's very interesting. You raised some points that I want us to dig in a little bit into in a different context. So you did say, not a different context, but same context. You did say about the space. So some of the two words or two phrases that were coming to me as you spoke was what a lot of folks leading change have to do, which is creating space. So when we're leading change, one of the things is collaboration is big. We have to collaborate. When we collaborate and bringing people together, what we spoke about earlier, the diversity of thoughts, the diversity of experience, diversity of knowledge, we can just only go so much. We can go just so much further than we can ever think about, And it's also about psychological safety, right? That space you spoke about in terms of, do people feel safe enough to be able to voice their thoughts, to voice their concerns, to voice their suggestions? And our role and responsibility as change leaders is to create that space for people to be able to do that. Is to able to bring people together to collaborate in what it is that we're doing. And when we think about your book and we think about one's biology, which, you talk about, we're talking about our energy, emotions, our instincts. How can change leaders use that biology, that energy, that emotion and instincts to be able to create that space, to be able to lead change more effectively and move the needle?
Yeah, listen, you've said so much there. I will tell you, but let me just back up for a second and say a lot of research, but again, you don't need research to know this. You can just, again, everybody can be a student of their own experience and see for yourself. So it's actually very difficult to motivate someone else, but you can dramatically influence the environment within which they choose to motivate themselves or not. So for any leader and we're all leaders, we all have an influence at any given moment on the situation at hand. So for starters, when we talk about psychological safety, why is it even relevant? Why did that even come to the fore? Well, because when Google did their data-driven research piece around Project Aristotle, they found out that for teams to perform at peak levels of proficiency, that was the one attribute that they concluded the team needed, was psychological safety. What nobody talked about, though, is there are a couple of precursors to the quality of my mental state. The first is the quality of my physical state, which then has a bearing on the quality of my emotional state, both of which have a bearing on the quality of my mental state. And let's not forget that we migrate from states to traits. So when someone talks about another individual's character traits, what they're really saying is, what is it like to be in your presence more often than not? So the first question for your listeners is, do you know what it's like for someone to be in your presence more often than not? And if it's hard and not easy, if it's heavy and not light, or if it's encouraging versus discouraging, or possibility oriented versus otherwise, those are all very real questions to ask yourself. And depending upon how you answer that, there's going to be a direct bearing on the quality of the environment you're creating. I'll give you an example. If you're somebody who, let's say your team was calling a meeting and everybody who was attending that meeting thought you were on vacation, only to find out that 5 minutes into the meeting started, you open the door and you walk in and they find out that, oh my gosh, Yvonne, you're not on vacation. Well, this is so. Do you have time to be here for the meeting? Yes, I thought it was so important that I be here. That is amazing. So if Yvonne is the type of person who has a track record of being positively possibility oriented, solution oriented, constructive, we accept what is and then we build up, supportive, et cetera, mindful of the mission, why we're here, where we're going, all those things, then the response you're going to get from the room is going to be uplifting. It's going to be like, Yvonne, come sit next to me. No, come sit next to me. If, on the other hand, when you open the door, people are like, oh, I thought you were on vacation. Oh, I'm sure you can find a seat somewhere. So this is not about judging ourselves. This is about becoming more aware of what is it like to be in your presence. If someone were to describe your character traits, which is the habitual norm of you, what would that consist of? And so if we start with physical state, so how you are physically in terms of your holistic health and well-being matters. If you feel, I have my 10,000 steps in today, I ate a great breakfast, so my food is my fuel, and I have amazing relationships, and I've been moving throughout the day, etc., and I had a great sleep last night, etc., then my physical state will arc to produce an emotional state that is very much bring it on. We've got this. We can do it. Let me just listen first. I have all the patience in the world, etc. If, on the other hand, I've been chained to my desk for a week, I haven't slept well in Lord knows how long because of all these various reasons. And no, listen, fast food is my fuel, and I'm not where I could be. Well, then your physical state is going to arc more towards a very short fuse. And in fact, in biological terms, have you ever heard of the expression narrow-mindedness or tunnel vision? Okay, these are physiological realities that befall us when our physical state is compromised. So we would do well to be mindful of the quality of our physical state, because if you're tired, and by the way, let me just say this, some recent research concluded that when we are exhausted, we are prone to selfishness. So do you want to guess why that might make sense? Even though we've never talked about the research, but why might that make sense to you? So when someone's logical, why might they be prone to selfishness?
When they're logical.
Listen, when you're exhausted, more information travels from your body to your brain than your brain to your body. So your body's trying to tell your brain, hold on, everybody, red alert, we don't have the energy. You can't give what you don't have.
Decision fatigue, like once fatigued, making the right decisions is difficult. I tend to default to the other part of what we're saying when we talk about the path of least resistance, right? Literally, when I'm really tired. That's when you can literally just ask me any question or ask me for anything. I say, just do it, because you just don't want to make you're tired. You're exhausted.
So here's the thing. So your physical state was affecting your emotional state, which then has a bearing on your mental state. And where emotions are concerned, just very briefly, it only takes about 6 seconds for the biochemistry of any emotion to make its way through your system. And your listeners say, there's no way my emotions only last for 6 seconds. No. I said the biochemistry associated with a particular emotional reaction. Your emotional state might last a lot longer because of your thoughts about that state. So if you ruminate for a few hours on a particular emotional state, it's called your mood. If you do it for a few days, it's called your temperament. And if you do it for a few weeks, it's called essentially a trait, right? And that's why it's so important to insert yourself to be mindful of what is my current state, because if it's suboptimal, just know that that's going to have a bearing on the quality of your mental state, i.e. your ability to access the best of your intellect. So when you talk about creating a psychologically safe space, it starts with, are we in a physically safe space? And I know that sounds intuitively obvious, but if we're in the middle of an earthquake right now, you can't say, Carl, just give me 5 more minutes of the podcast before we conclude. No, we go into survival mode and we're out, right?
Yes.
So you need physical safety. Fine. We get all that. Fortunately, we live in an area where that is rarely going to be an issue. But then what about the quality of your emotional state? And how mindful are you of that? And why does that matter? Cole's Notes version turns out we feel before we think. In other words, when we take in the world through our 5 senses, those signals travel through our limbic or emotional center en route to our thinking center. So if you're human, and all of us are, we feel before we think. But here's the kicker. How you feel right now is an internal state. But your emotion is an external expression of that internal state.
Yes.
And the more mindful you are of that internal state, the greater your ability to do something about it if the emotion you convey to the outside world is going to have a less than positive emotional contagion effect on others. So back to creating the kind of space that we want to create, these are some of the core tenets that you would do well to understand so you can intercept. One last thought. When working with General Stanley McChrystal at one point, I asked him, what is your favorite go-to when it comes to training, developing others in the face of change, etc.? He said, Carl, that's easy. When under duress, we default to our level of training. So I said to him, if you're somebody who hasn't practiced going to your top values or those of the organization you represent to understand behaviorally how it is you're going to show up in any given moment, if you're not practiced at doing that, then what does your behavior look like in the midst of a challenging moment? And he said, that's a great question. I guess you just behave however you behave in the moment. I go, yeah, if you're a hothead, you get hotter. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm not interested in reporting into a leader where that's it. I want a reflectively responsive leader. I don't want an automatically reactive one. Well, the only chance I have at either being a reflectively responsive leader or reporting into one is if we practice being more self-aware about physical state, emotional state, mental state, and then doing our level best to lean into our strengths and contribute accordingly. Does that make sense?
Yes. You know, Carl, you just raised so many cool points there, so many valid points, so many things that we can introduce into how we lead and drive change. And as you were speaking, one of the things that I remember, what I loved most about, always having the conversations with you was your approach to emotional intelligence and how big you're on emotional intelligence. And I want to take it a little bit back to that. Right now, we're faced with disruption, uncertainty, change leaders. We're in the organization. You're giving this one project, this one change, the next thing, an external force happens and you have to change directions and shift to another project, or your budgets are cut and you have to navigate quickly. You have to also work with your teams. You have to work with your stakeholders. There's just so much that is happening when we think about disruption, AI adoption, economic uncertainty, socioeconomic issues going on around us. How can leaders practice emotional intelligence? How can even team members, how can change leaders, whatever role we play in organizations, how can we practice emotional intelligence when it
Yeah.
comes to having to still lead through that change, still push through that change, and still navigate it? So there are three different things that we're leading the change, we're navigating it ourselves,
Mhm.
you know, and we're driving it as well, whether in our individual work. How can we practice and leverage emotional intelligence as a
Yeah, I
tool?
mean, emotional intelligence is really just being more intelligent about our emotions. So I would say it starts with not trying to assume them away. I know many a leader who says, emotions are things best left at home. And I say, good luck with that, right? As I said, physiologically, you feel before you can think. So if you're dismissive of how the room might be feeling, that does not mean you can always make decisions that everybody likes, but just being attuned to the level of resonance that you're either co-creating or not. The opposite of resonance is dissonance. So
Mm.
being very mindful of whether or not we're actually aligning how we might be feeling about something with, okay, so now what is it we want to do? But to be very tactical about it, let me just say this. When we encounter a threat of any kind, you were framing it through the lens of the magnitude of change, the pace, something I didn't want or didn't like or what have you. How can we lead our way through that? Well, here's the thing. When we encounter a threat, when it's a physical threat, of course, most people are accustomed to hearing that cortisol floods your supercomputer, the blood and adrenaline in your body rushes to your big muscles because you're getting ready to what? Fight or flight. Okay, we've heard
Yeah.
of that. But what a lot of people still don't realize is that your body reacts physiologically the same way to a perceived threat as it does a physical threat. So that email that you received in all bold letters or capital letters or lack of grammar or whatever, if you perceive a threat on the other side, a threat to your promotion, a threat to your employment, a threat to your brand, a threat to, if that's your perception,
Mm.
your body is going to react the same way in that moment as it did if it was a physical threat, meaning the cortisol is going to flood the supercomputer. You will be incapacitated, incapable of accessing the best of your intellect in those moments. It's called an emotional hijack. So when leaders are actually sometimes the cause of those in their care feeling threatened, as in, you better get this done or else, or you know what we're dealing with, if we don't figure this out, then if the recipients interpret that as a threat, just know, so-called leader, you were the very cause of incapacitating the very person you needed at their best in the moment you needed them at their best. So you are no leader. Back to the kind of space that we're co-creating. But when you're armed with this insight, here's the really interesting thing. So our parasympathetic nervous system actually gets triggered and cued when we operate in one of 4 different modes: when we are mindful or compassionate or playful or hopeful. Now that might just sound like a bunch of technical jargon, but it's so profound. Imagine, so what it means is if you are mindfully compassionate and also hopeful and even playful, you bring some sense of, listen, we can do this. Let's figure it out. Maybe it's a 10x, maybe it's whatever the case may be. That has a wonderful way of allowing us to be attuned to one another, with one another in a way where the art of the possible starts to turn into a positive, road of action, etc., that is going to mean something. But here's the reason I say that. Because the ancient Stoics taught us that how we see the issue is the issue, right?
Yeah.
You and I joke, we saw the same movie. You said, what a celebration. I said, what a tragedy. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. So let me ask you this. If you're somebody who just witnessed something and you frame it as through a compassionate lens, through a supportive lens, through a constructive lens, through an opportunistic lens, that's going to be very different in terms of how your physiology gets triggered from someone who views it as a threat with
Yeah.
a scarcity mindset, where there's only so much to go around. There isn't enough for everyone. Gotta look out for number one. So depending upon which lens you look through, one is abundant, one is scarcity. Here's the bottom line. Once you are emotionally hijacked, you're triggered. The physiological cues are going to happen. But the moral of the story is we're not all triggered equally. In other words, if the leader in me shows up to the conversation with you, Yvonne, then I'm going to be constantly focused on how do I simply make this moment a little better than it otherwise would have been if I wasn't here. That's the leader in me. So I'm not going to interpret what you say as a threat. I'm not going to interpret that system change or budget change. I'm going to be very curious about how is it serving the mission? What is my understanding of that? The mission gives context for the perspective, the attitude, the lens I'm looking through. It's the leader in me that has that well in hand. Now I'm curious about what can we do next within our circle of influence to make things just a little better than had we not been here as a team. Now, conversely, if I have a scarcity mindset, I'm only concerned about myself, et cetera, I'm going to get hijacked all the time. And when that happens, I'm simply not going to be able to access the best of my intellect, and the ideas and the inputs and the suggestions are going to be suboptimal relative to what I otherwise could have done. So becoming more aware of just these core tenets and not assuming it away. Do you know even the word emotion derives from evoking motion?
Mm.
And you might say, motion in what direction? Exactly. So, what is that current emotion teaching you? Before you infect everybody else with it, pause, ask yourself what the more constructive approach would be. And then there's any number of tactics and techniques you can do to help de escalate or self regulate so that the better version of you is the leader in you is available more often than the cynic, the victim, or the spectator.
Thank you. It reminded me of some writing I was doing the other day. And I was writing about, is it really, are your people really resisting change? Or are they resisting the way you're leading the change? And what you said in terms of the reaction you're creating in people, in how you show up, could be what's resulting in the pushback people might be demonstrating when they hear about the change. So you go into the room, how you're presenting the change, how you're leading through the change, how you're communicating the change, the energy you're bringing into the change, the emotions, the words you're evoking, the
Yes.
emotions that you're evoking can create that flight or fight response in people, or how they respond positively or negatively to the change. Even neuroscience tells us, people sometimes it's not the bad news that they get affected by, it's how it's delivered or how they feel it impacts them. All of those things create resulting effects and emotions within us. And as change leaders, it is our responsibility to be very mindful of that energy that is that we're bringing into the room to people. We have to be very mindful of how we're communicating that change into people. We have to be very mindful about our own emotions, that we're feeding off to others. So
I love that. And Yvonne, use that. So just imagine for your listeners, just for fun, the next time they walk into a room and they're part of an engagement or a conversation with even just one person or several, give some thought to, call it, being mindful of the energy in the room when you enter. Maybe it's at a high, maybe it's at sort of a, yeah, every day is fine. Maybe it's at a bit of a low point. And then just ask yourself, if it's on a high, can you at least sustain that? If not, elevate it even a little more. And if
yeah,
it's on a low, can you again just elevate a little more? But what you don't want to do is be the cause. Sometimes you've heard me joke about, rather than cause and effect, it's, are you mindful of the fact that you're causing an effect? And
yeah,
so what kind of an effect do you want to cause? And so again, back to even just bringing mindfulness to that, which is simply being aware of what's actually crossing your mind's eye at any given point in time. Even the word mindset just means setting your mind. So how intentional are you going to be about sustaining the energy in the room, but hopefully even elevating it? You do that in your own original way, whether it's a soft smile, an encouraging tap on the shoulder, an open-ended question to help someone understand how great they are, or to give them the floor, or a positive word, or an action, or whatever the case may be that you think you're best positioned to offer. Experiment with that and see for yourself the kind of influence that's going to have.
mm,
And at the end of the day, even if you Google the word change, it deals with something along the lines of altering or modifying. Okay, fine. That could be altering or modifying a person or a situation or a circumstance. But here's the kicker. If that alteration or modification is inside out, if you've been celebrating my strengths and aligning those strengths with a need that your business has, and then celebrating me for that effort, do you not think I'm going to love the kind of change and the influence we can have on it together? You bet I will. But if
yeah,
you try to say, here's what's going on around us, and you better do this, this way. In other words, you're trying to force it upon me instead of encouraging it to emanate from me. Those are two very different dynamics. And the best leaders help others not only come to know the best in themselves, but they actually create the space for that best to be contributed in service of a need that is relevant, that matters, a purpose and a mission. So you know the purpose, and now you're on purpose with purpose. You know the values that you align around, and so you take responsibility to behave accordingly, and you are marching in the direction of the vision.
Yes.
And
And you,
so,
yeah. And you just put things there. So not only did you talk about emotional intelligence in terms of how we can be more emotionally intelligent, you also wrapped it up with even empathy, as in understanding who it is that you're working with, who your stakeholders are, who your teams are, and looking at it from this perspective and bringing out the best in
and
them.
Yvonne, that's huge. What you just said is so huge. So very quickly, again, for your listeners, I had someone once come up to me and say, Carl, you would say I'm great at empathizing, right? Like, take you, for example. I mean, don't I do a good job of empathizing with you? And I smiled, and just for fun, on purpose, I said this to make a point, but I said, well, in fairness to you, how can you? You don't even know me. And I thought they said, Carl Oxholm, we're friends. I said, we are friends. And they said, and you know everything about me. I said, I do, but tell me what you know about me. What do you know about what I perceive my greatest strengths to be, or where I'd like to be in a few years? Or if I allow, which I'm more than happy to, the dynamic of my family and how it shapes the context within which I do what I do, say what I say, go where I want to go, etc. What do you know about that? And by the way, can you find out about those things and not have it feel intrusive? And he was like, oh my gosh, yes, of course. And you know all that about me, and I'm sorry. And then proceeded to say, oh, that hurts, but okay. Anyway, I'll see you later. And I laughed and I said, there's no time like the present. You can still just ask some questions now. But the point I was raising was this. Research shows that the deeper the quality of your relationship with someone, the greater your ability to influence them in a positive way. No one's going to deny that. Everybody can think of their own circles and understand that. But here's the kicker. We have a tendency, even though everybody agrees with that, they actually know very little about the individuals on their teams as individuals, as people. They know more about them. They know what their credentials are, or the role they played before, or their work history. They know very little about the individual. But I will tell you, you would do very well to do what you said, which is to get to know them. Why? Coming back to your point, empathy is not just putting yourself in someone else's shoes, because if that was where it ended, a huge mistake could happen where a lot of people think they're good at empathizing because they do put themselves in someone else's shoes, but they do it as themselves.
Mm.
But empathy is about walking a mile in my shoes. It's me knowing, how can I put myself in Yvonne's shoes as her? And
Yeah.
I can't do that if I don't know the context of her, where
Yeah.
she's come from, who she is, where she wants to go, why she is the way she is. But you give me that context, and I have a completely different ability to influence not only the way in which we team together, but the way in which we can face change together and do it in a way that lights one another up, right? And celebrates the strengths of who we are. So that's a nuance that you threw in there that I want to point out is often misunderstood, and it leads to a lot of conflict where there could have been opportunity, right?
Yes. And one of the takeaways that I'm going to be leaving this conversation with that you just dropped was small talk. That's where small talk comes in, right? And that was what jumped to my mind, small talk. That small talk you have before the big meeting begins, that small talk you have at the end of the meeting, that small talk you have when you're walking down the hallway, that's that opportunity to get to know that person on a different level. And it doesn't always have to be about work. Many times we come in, we just want to get straight into it. But that small talk you spend time doing is what could make the biggest difference in how you connect, how you influence, how you build that relationship with that person that it is you want to work with. And it could be influenced up, it could be influenced sideways, it could be influenced down. But that small talk makes all the difference. So
I will say, Yvonne, the more you allow someone in, the greater the data points you're sharing with them about who you are, the greater it facilitates their ability to indeed empathize with you
mm,
and to collaborate and share, et cetera. So you don't have to, but it's just an interesting insight that, you know, the more you allow someone to get to know you, the greater their ability to work with you.
yes, we could have this conversation forever. I'm going to wrap it up, bring it all home. And one last question I have for you, okay, maybe the second to the last question is, when I think about it, we can all agree that right now we are experiencing unprecedented levels of change, disruption, uncertainty. We've never experienced change as we're experiencing today. And more even socioeconomic issues, when you turn on the news, what you're seeing, what you're hearing. On a personal level, how are you feeling about the current state of the world right now?
Yeah, I listen, choose to always be hopeful and to operate accordingly. And not only because I know it's good for my own physiology and my ability, again, to trigger that parasympathetic nervous system and access the best of what I have to offer, but it's really about, so I'm more of a dynamic goal setter than a static one. I'm more interested in how do I contribute in a way, again, that makes this moment the best that it can be, all things considered. That never changes regardless of what's going on outside of me. And so for me, super hopeful about getting to team with incredible minds like yours, your listeners, those who congregate and come together to make this place just again collectively a little better than it used to be. So tremendous hope. If I look at the people in my circle of influence, again, be mindful of the company you keep. These are extraordinary individuals who all understand the core tenets of what we're talking about. In fact, the people that are listening to this wouldn't even be listening if that wasn't a fabric of who they are. And so as I look across all of them, should I ever have the pleasure of getting to know any number of them in person, how could I be anything but hopeful? As long as, coming full circle to what I said at the outset, they never compromise on that, give the give themselves permission to be exactly who they are in service of that very moment, meaning bring the best of their network, their insight, their wisdom, their strengths in service of an interest that not only matters to them, but that the world at large says needs a little TLC.
Love that. Two words you used that I love. Like you said, hopeful. Yes, we have to remain hopeful. And I like what you said at the beginning. You started with choice. You choose. And that's what it is that we need to do because there's so much happening around us. But what's that choice we're making in how we respond to change?
Yes, and you know what? And Yvonne, so the world of research again says there are three constants in life. The first is change. The second happens to be choice. The third happens to be principles. So in theory, all we have to do is make principle-based choices in the face of never-ending change, and we'll be great. And when you ask yourself, oh my gosh, I love it. Why is it so hard? That might have something to do with a little thing called emotion. And that's why you wanted to tease out a little bit about how can we be more intelligent about our emotions so that the responses we're evoking from one another are on the constructive, optimistic, hopeful, loving, compassionate, empathetic side and not the alternative.
Thank you so much for that. And finally, there is so much to learn from you in your book, in the work you do. Where can people go to learn more about your book and the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be able to say just easiest is just go to virtuecompass.com, just all one word. And there's more than enough there to have a look at the book. The testimonials are heartwarming because so many different people from different schools of thought have had so many things to say about it that I never could have imagined or dreamed up on my own. And that to me is very heartwarming and perhaps helpful for those who are trying to understand if it could be of interest to them. And just, of course, a huge thank you to you for always doing the work that matters most and to leaning into your own strengths and being the very model of what I can only hope everyone else who listens to you and learns from you will do in kind, obviously in their own way.
You're so kind. Thank you. Thank you so much for having those lovely words to say about me. And thank you so much for honoring our invitation to speak to our audience again and again. And I know this isn't going to be the last time that we have you back to speak to our audience. Thank you so much, Carl, for being a blessing. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thanks to you and everybody for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Change Leadership Conversations. Be sure to hit the follow button, leave us a review, and share this podcast with your team or fellow change leaders, because leading change is better when we do it together.